Hello, and welcome everyone to Solar Geoengineering, warnings from scientists, Indigenous peoples, youth, and climate activists. I'm Carol Muffett, president of the Center for International Environmental Law, one of several conveners of today's event. As the climate emergency accelerates around us, the profound gap between the current response to the climate crisis and what is needed to stay below 1.5 degrees grows clearer by the day. The question is how we respond when time is of the essence. A clear majority of the world now recognizes that we must urgently end reliance on the fossil fuels that are driving climate change. But in recent years, a new narrative has emerged that the world should also consider more extreme measures, including solar geoengineering, either as a cheaper alternative to rapid emission cuts or as a fallback measure if emission cuts fall short. With governments and individuals investing billions and geoengineering experiments now actively being proposed, the solar geoengineering debate is no longer a future abstraction, it's a present reality. And while the idea of silver bullet solutions and fail-safe measures is gaining traction in public discourse, the profound limitations and very real risks of these technologies rarely get the serious scrutiny they deserve. Today's event is a first step in bridging that gap. It brings together two extraordinary panels of leading voices from the scientific community, Indigenous peoples, youth, and climate activists to share their expertise, their experience, and their perspectives on the rising risks of solar geoengineering. This event is being live streamed and shared by multiple organizations. Each of our panels will begin with a guided discussion, followed by a two-part Q&A, with the first part for press and the second for other participants. We encourage everyone to submit questions throughout the event. Due to the number of participants, we won't be able to respond to all of them, but we'll cover as many as we can. And for Spanish speakers, Spanish translation is available by clicking the interpretation icon in the lower right corner. The panels are being recorded and will be made available on Facebook, YouTube, and the Geoengineering Monitor website after the event ends. I'd now like to introduce Lily Fure, Head of International Environmental Policy for the Heinrich Böll Foundation, who will be moderating our first panel featuring perspectives on solar geoengineering from scientists. Lily.
Thank you, Carol. Welcome, good morning, good evening, good day. Greetings from Berlin, Germany, where I sit right now. I'm honored to be the moderator for this first science panel for today's event. On top of sort of working for the Heinrich Böll Foundation here in Berlin, I'm also on the board of etc. Group, ETC Group, another co-organizer of this event. I'm also a member of the steering committee for the Hands of Mother Earth campaign, of which you'll hear more throughout the event today. I'll introduce our amazing panelists shortly to you, but I want to just add a few introductory remarks to set the scene, adding to what Carol already said. So why this event and why now? In the face of these rising impacts of climate change, as described by Carol already, we're seeing talk about these once unthinkable technologies, these ideas, geoengineering, rise to the surface. They're becoming part of our mainstream climate policy debate. They are large-scale technological interventions and schemes to address some of the symptoms of climate change, not its root causes. There are, as some of you might know, various types and groups of approaches of geoengineering. We'll stick with just one type for today, solar geoengineering, which is about manipulating radiative forcing. Solar geoengineering is also called solar radiation modification or manipulation, or short SRM. These technologies are still largely speculative and untested, and I have been unthinkable ideas for a good reason, and we'll explore that further today. So this panel now will walk us through some of the core issues that we have to consider when discussing these technologies, their uncertainties, their risks, their potential, and their already real impacts. But just to say, stay tuned for the second round later, or a second panel, where we'll look at a concrete experiment that was planned and stopped in Sweden, and hear voices from civil society, movements, Indigenous peoples, and youth. And we'll also have some exciting news to share with you. The structure for this first panel, which is just 1 hour, so that's a challenge for such a big topic, is that we'll start with just one question to all three panelists, and then have a moderated panel discussion throughout which I will try to incorporate as many questions from the audience as possible, but bear with us, we won't be able to address and answer all of your questions, but we'll make sure to update our information on the Geoengineering Monitor website after the event, and you'll find more information there. So now to our panelists. Welcome to this event, and thank you so much for joining us. We have Michael Mann. He's a distinguished professor of atmospheric science at Penn State and director of the Penn State Earth System Science Center. I don't think that either of the panelists today need much introduction, but I want to say a few words. Michael is also co-founder of the science website worldclimate.org. In his latest book, in a series of many, is The New Climate War, The Fight to Take Back Our Planet, which also discusses geoengineering. We have Jenny Stevens, who's Dean's Professor of Sustainability Science and Policy at Northeastern University, which is in Boston, and Director of Northeastern School of Public Policy and Urban Affairs. And Jenny's research, teaching, and community engagement focuses on social justice, economic justice, and racial justice in climate and energy policy. Her latest book has the title Diversifying Power, Why We Need Anti-Racist Feminist Leadership on Climate and Energy. And we'll hear more from that perspective from Jenny. And we have Raymond Pierre Humbert, who's Halley Professor at Physics at Oxford University, a fellow of the Royal Society, where he leads the Planetary Climate Dynamics Group that conducts research on planetary atmospheres, their associated climates, their origins and evolutions. And Ray has many, many books on these topics as well. So this is a really distinguished panel with lots of things to say. So I'm going to ask you all one question, one and the same question to all of you as a starting point, and you'll have 5 minutes to answer that. So the question is, you've all raised serious warnings about the prospects of solar geoengineering. If you could still distill those concerns into just a few key messages for the audience today, what is it that you want people to take away? What would those core messages be? In short, why is this a bad idea? I'll start with Mike, then Jenny, then Ray.
Yeah, I'll make some brief comments. Happy to elaborate further, but I don't think I'll need 5 minutes myself just to lay out that you know the basic picture here, which is that geoengineering, the problems with it, in my view, fall into two basic categories. One is just based on the science. The science tells us that if we engage in this unprecedented manipulation with our planetary environment, there could be some deep unintended consequences. We are ultimately toying with a system that we don't understand perfectly. And the idea that we can cover up the effect of increased carbon pollution and the warming of the planet from that through some other unprecedented intervention with the system is, in my view, very foolish. And it's foolish because the science that we've done, the climate modeling experiments, and I know Ray and the others can speak to this as well, the climate modeling experiments that we have done suggest that if we were to try to block out the sunlight by shooting sulfate aerosols into the stratosphere to mimic what a volcanic eruption does, but we do this on essentially a perpetual basis. It would be the equivalent of a Mount Pinatubo eruption, the big 1991 volcanic eruption of Mount Pinatubo in the Philippines. It would be like doing that every few years. And that would likely change the atmospheric circulation by reducing the shortwave radiation, the direct solar radiation from the sun coming down. It would likely dry out our continents. We could see more widespread drought. It would change atmospheric circulation patterns, perhaps in an unintended, in an unanticipated way. And that could actually cause some areas to warm even faster at the expense of other areas cooling. it would likely, just considering the atmospheric chemistry of it now, increase ozone destruction, acid rain. So this is, it harkens back to a nursery rhyme, or a song rather, that many of us here in the States learned when we were growing up. I'm not sure the Europeans in the audience will recognize it, but it starts out, there was an old lady who swallowed a fly. And then it goes on.
I don't know that one as a German.
Well, here's the basic idea. She swallowed the fly, then she swallowed a frog to swallow the fly. And she keeps on swallowing these larger and larger creatures until ultimately she ends up swallowing a horse. And what killed her, it wasn't the fly, it was the horse, of course. So beware of a cover-up of an intervention that could very well leave us worse off than we had started. So that's basically on the science side of it. And I know Ray will speak to this, and Jenny will probably speak to this as well. Then there is the other problem, which is sort of the political, the socio-political impacts of proposing these techno fixes. This idea that we can deploy this radical new technology maybe a decade down the road, 2 decades down the road, provides a crutch to polluters to say, look, we can continue burning fossil fuels because we've got a solution that we will deploy if we need to. That's the moral hazard. It potentially leads us down this path of ever greater engagement in this very dangerous intervention, sulfate aerosol geoengineering. We sometimes call it solar radiation management, but that's really a misnomer. It makes it sound like we've got our hands on the knob of the sun and we're just turning it down. That seems very inert. That seems very safe. That's not what we're doing. We're playing with atmospheric chemistry. We're playing with the large scale circulation of the atmosphere in an unprecedented way. It's anything but managing the problem. And so we're seeing polluters, and I'm sure we'll get into this, and I talk about this at some depth in the new climate war. This is one of the tactics in what I call the new climate war. One of the ways that polluters are trying to prevent us from moving away from fossil fuels, from which they profit greatly. And so they're offering up false solutions. And among the most pernicious of these false solutions is the promise of geoengineering. And it's not a coincidence that you've got people like Rex Tillerson, the former CEO of ExxonMobil, the world's largest fossil fuel company. You have people like him on record saying that this is just an engineering problem. And you've got people like Bill Gates now advocating this dangerous path forward, in part because they downplay the role that clean, renewable energy. We have a safe way to solve this problem. It's by getting off fossil fuels. It's by transitioning to renewable energy. And so the idea that we would instead take this extremely risky path is a foolish gambit, as I said before. And I'll leave my comments with that.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you. So it's basically a new wave of denialism we're seeing from the big polluters.
Inactivism, as I call it.
Yes, inactivism. Jenny, so why, in your view, is this a bad idea? And I'm sure you'll speak to also some, which type of folks actually come up with these ideas. And we've seen, some of the wordings and frames that Michael has already described. So over to you.
Yeah, well, thank you. And it's great to be part of this very important event, elevating the concerns and the risks here. So as the climate crisis gets worse, what's really important is that we pay attention and get involved to ensure that all the climate actions and climate investments are based on climate justice. And what I mean by climate justice is really requiring us to focus on who is being harmed, who is benefiting from the status quo, who is resisting the changes, and who is being included and excluded. So climate justice actually requires us to diversify the voices that we listen to and focus on supporting those who are most vulnerable rather than further concentrating power for those who are most privileged. So what I want to do in the 5 minutes that I have is to explain from a social science perspective why advancing solar geoengineering is not compatible with climate justice. So as a woman trained in environmental science and engineering, who has now been doing social science research on climate action, climate technologies, and climate justice for the past 25 years, what I've learned from my experiences is that there are two interconnected reasons why we've been ineffective and inadequate in our responses to the climate crisis. The first is the concentration of wealth and power, including the widening income and wealth gap that has resulted in undue power and influence of the polluter elite, as Michael also mentioned, who are profiting and resisting the changes that are needed. And the second has to do with the reason we've been ineffective is that we've been focusing too narrowly on technology and technological innovation, while we have not been investing enough in people, communities, social innovation, social infrastructure, and social change. So when we focus too much on technological change and not enough on social change, we really fail to prioritize social justice, economic justice, racial justice, and all of these problematic power dynamics that so many of our policies and priorities. So in my view, the recent interest in investment in advancing solar geoengineering results directly from both of those, the concentration of power and the focus on technology. And we need to resist and go in the opposite direction on both of those fronts. So from a climate justice perspective, I want to highlight kind of 3 reasons why investing in solar geoengineering is really dangerous and why we should not be advancing this technological approach. The first is because solar geoengineering reinforces the power of wealthy elites and creates yet another mechanism to concentrate power and have a few people have control over everyone else. And when we analyze who is advocating for solar geoengineering research and who is funding solar geoengineering research, we see that it continues to be dominated by white male scientists from the global north, funded by tech billionaires and other elite philanthropy. And this masculine, controlling, technocratic view of the climate crisis is dangerous because it excludes other perspectives and constrains authentic public deliberation about the multiple risks of manipulating the Earth systems. So to move beyond this dominant, narrow, technocratic narrative, we really need more diverse voices. Research shows that women, people of color, indigenous peoples, and others from marginalized identities, we bring different life experiences, different priorities, and different perceptions of risk. So this event is a great a great step in broadening the public discourse, and I'm really appreciative for that. The second reason that it's really dangerous is that solar geoengineering undermines and slows down the transformation away from fossil fuels to renewables. Michael mentioned that already. We need to shift from this extractive and exploitive fossil fuel society to a prosperous and regenerative renewable-based society. And that has to be our priority. So we can't be perpetuating ideas that there's some futuristic technological fix for that makes that transformation less urgent or less essential. So it's a dangerous distraction for the struggles ahead. And finally, I just want to say that we need holistic approaches, and this is a narrow approach to climate. And given the so many consequences and the complexities that Michael also mentioned, we need to be going in the opposite direction. Instead of trying to respond with narrow approaches, we need to recognize that these challenges facing society are linked, and the best opportunities for change are when we address those together, not in isolation. So we need climate action that connects with jobs and economic security, and climate action that improves public health and reduces disparities, and climate action that connects with housing, food systems, transportation, and resource distribution. So overall, climate justice requires us to decenter this white, masculine, technocratic, elite kind of power, the kind of power that has been dominant for too long and has been contributing to the extractive and exploitative systems that are the root of the climate crisis. And climate justice requires us to prioritize systemic changes and societal transformation. And that means we must resist this narrow technological approach, including solar geoengineering.
Thank you, Jenny. One point that really sticks with me is that those opposing geoengineering are often accused of taking options off the table. And you just really explained really well how actually promoting and researching geoengineering takes a lot of the other real solutions off the table. So that's a very, very important point. Thank you for highlighting that. Raymond, you're next.
Thank you very much. So as has been hinted at before, the global warming problem, the climate crisis, is in essence a disease that's caused by the root cause of having too much carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And solar geoengineering seeks to address it not by treating the root cause, which would require us to eliminate fossil fuel burning from our economies, but rather than treating the root cause, it treats a symptom. It's like taking painkillers. And we know from we know it's very, very clearly, if you treat a symptom and ignore the root cause for very long, the consequences are usually fatal. And the same applies to the climate system and the climate crisis. But I want to focus on one particular way in which treating the symptom rather than the root cause would lead to an extremely perilous future. And this reason alone that I'm about to explain is sufficient to prove that there is essentially no future in which any kind of solar geoengineering could conceivably play a significant role in the portfolio of responses to the climate crisis. And that's what I call the mismatch, the problem of millennial commitment and mismatch in timescale. So the first thing to know about carbon dioxide is that it's removed from the atmosphere very, very slowly by geological processes. The carbon dioxide that we have put in the atmosphere so far has ratcheted up the temperature of the planet. And the temperature of the planet won't recover for thousands and thousands of years after we have stopped emitting carbon dioxide. And the more we emit carbon dioxide, the more we essentially irreversibly ratchet up the temperature. And there's no going back from that underlying temperature set point that we're doing. Now, what happens if you ignore the root cause, but try to just cool down the planet by shooting some chemicals up into the stratosphere that reflect some sunlight and cool it down? Well, you probably can cause some global mean cooling, but people don't live in an average climate. They live in the climate of their region. These regional climate disruptions could be extremely severe and extremely adverse. But what's even worse is that the particles, the chemicals you shoot up into the stratosphere, into the upper atmosphere to cause more reflection of sunlight, only stay up there for a year or two. So that means you're taking a root cause that continues to harm the globe for thousands of years, and you're trying to cancel out with something that has to be maintained each and every year. And what's worse, because carbon dioxide accumulates in the atmosphere, then each year that you treat the symptom with solar geoengineering instead of addressing the root cause, which is carbon dioxide emissions, the amount of solar geoengineering you do has to be increased. And then what happens if suddenly something happens? You find adverse side effects. There's a climate-induced war because people can't agree on what kind of climate they want. There's a world depression. There's a world war. Who knows what? A lot can happen.
Election in a key country.
Elections that can put somebody with really bad judgment into power. Any of those things could actually force a disruption, an unplanned disruption, a termination of solar geoengineering. And at that point, you have 100 or possibly hundreds of years of pent-up global warming, which hits you in the face in a matter of a decade or so. It's in many ways worse even than the threat of global thermonuclear war in terms of the possible loss of life and the amount of the proportion of the world that this would affect. So that's what I call termination shock, and it's an absolutely outrageous sort of commitment to lay on future generations, to say that we are going to do something for our own benefit right now so we can continue emitting fossil fuels, emitting carbon dioxide from fossil fuels, and make a few people richer. At the same time, a lot of other people are not getting richer and enjoying the benefits of growing economies. And we'll do that at the cost of hoping that the next 10,000 years or so of humanity will continue maintaining this technological intervention without fail. And that's just an outrageous sort of intergenerational burden to put on the future generations. And there are many, many other things that will probably come out in this discussion that say that solar geoengineering is just a completely ludicrous idea and an absolutely preposterous disruption to the only one business that there is in the climate crisis, which is to get the carbon dioxide emissions down to zero as soon as we possibly can.
Yeah, thank you. And you make clear why this is also a topic of concern for the young youth climate movement, why future generations and current generations and young people need to be concerned about this. And what also strikes me in what you described in terms of termination shock and how that could play out is that many people say, because we failed to properly do international climate diplomacy through the UN climate agreement, and those commitments have failed, and international governance has failed us in that regard to do what is actually necessary, we'll just reinvent another governance structure to govern, these dangerous technologies, and that just sounds not very smart to me. Thank you for that. I have lots of questions myself, and I see there are questions coming in from the chat, so I'll try and direct them to some of you. But you feel free to indicate if you want to jump in and speak, and let's try to keep interventions now as short and precise as possible, so we can cover as much space as possible. So there's probably to Michael and Ray questions on how this could potentially affect the water cycle, if you could speak to that, and maybe also what that means for agriculture. I would add that point, and food security. And then I'm wondering, Ray, when you say there is no future where geoengineering can play any role and make things better, what does that mean for geoengineering research today, in your view? Maybe we'll start with Michael and then Ray, and then I have questions for you, Jenny, as well.
Yeah, so geoengineering, in a sense, sulfate aerosol geoengineering, it has a short-term analog. It's an explosive volcanic eruption, particularly a tropical volcanic eruption that puts a large amount of sulfate aerosol into the stratosphere. And so it's sort of a natural experiment that we've seen play out. And one of the things we know, when you do have one of these large eruptions, because of the reduction in incoming sunlight, and remember the sun sort of helps evaporate water from the ocean, it puts moisture in the atmosphere. So when you reduce the incoming sunlight, you're reducing the amount of moisture in the atmosphere, and in particular over land regions where there isn't even a source of moisture, you potentially see a large amount of drying. And we see that after these large tropical volcanic eruptions. You see a tendency for the continents to dry out, a reduction in the hydrological cycle, if you will. You also, as you allude to, reduce the incoming sunlight that's used by plants for photosynthesis. So you potentially reduce the productivity of plants and crops. And so here, now we're talking about some indirect effects that could be catastrophic. I mean, we live on a finite planet with finite food and water and space, and geoengineering could increase the competition for less available crop yields, lower crop yields. So both of those things add to the list of problems with these sorts of interventions.
Thank you. And then also we had a question in the chat that asked, so is it mostly about the risks that are, potential future risks of implementation, or is it the moral hazard of, giving excuses? And you make it clear it's actually both. Those are both really severe concerns. Okay, Ray.
Yes. So to what Mike said about the hydrological cycle, about the water cycle, I'll add that many of the really critical rainfall producing systems, like the monsoons, depend on the difference in heating between land and ocean. Ocean doesn't heat up very fast because a lot of water that you distribute the heat around. Land heats up very quickly because heat doesn't get into the dirt very quickly. And so monsoon circulations, which billions of people rely on, would be affected in ways that are very difficult to predict if solar geoengineering were used to offset the warming caused by carbon dioxide. And I would say that that one of the biggest problems is that although our climate models do pretty well at forecasting large-scale climate changes that are due to carbon dioxide, we do less well at regional temperature and even less well in models at predicting what's going on in regional precipitation patterns. That's one of the hardest things to predict. We can predict something bad happens somewhere, but exactly where and how much is still a difficult thing for climate models to do. And so that's even though we've had a lot of experience in trying to understand what carbon dioxide does. And now we have no experience with what the world would actually look like with deployed solar geoengineering. We have to learn that before we actually, we would have to learn that whole modeling technology and refinement in order to even know what we had done to the planet. And so that's one of the biggest risks I see in terms of precipitation, in terms of rainfall patterns. Now, as for the reduction in solar radiation reaching the surface, something that people should also realize is that reflecting sunlight back to space with particles in the upper atmosphere that reflects some sunlight back to space, but it has an even bigger effect on what reaches the ground in the terms of the fact that it also scatters light from the direct beam of the sun sideways. That gives you, instead of a blue sky, a milky sky. So you get a big increase in diffuse radiation. And that benefits some plants, but it disadvantages other ones. So if you take that together with what carbon dioxide is also already doing in benefiting some plants and hurting others, we're making a major and unprecedented, we'd be making a major and unprecedented change in the basic driving forces of ecosystem structure, natural ecosystems as well as crops, which again is something in the area that we have very little ability to anticipate in advance. So it's the lady who swallows the fly problem again. It will inevitably lead to swallowing the horse, and then she died, of course. I think that's a great zone.
And the world is actually not a machine that we have built ourselves and understand 101 and can take apart and engineer and re-engineer. And it's a complex system. Yes, we're beginning to understand how much we don't know, I think. Ray, can you just speak a little bit to the other question I had on when there's no future for geoengineering that we can imagine, then what does that mean for research today?
Oh yes, yeah. So you know, most of the serious scientists I know who are advocating research on solar geoengineering are not saying this is something we should deploy instead of reducing carbon dioxide. Now, of course, if they develop the technology, it won't be their choice whether somebody deploys it or not. So that's not much of an argument. But the people, most of the people advocating research on solar geoengineering are saying we're just doing this just in case. But they never really ask the question, in case of what? What are the scenarios in which you actually could deploy it? If there is really no reasonable scenario where this can contribute significantly to addressing the problem of the climate crisis, why do the research? Because we know the research has risks in terms of moral hazard, in terms of developing technology that somebody else could easily deploy, even if the scientists who developed it don't think it should be deployed, even if we find even more reasons that it's dangerous. And so I would say that there just isn't enough of a scenario in which this would be remotely a conceivably good thing to do to the climate. There's not enough of a scenario in which we want to do this to the world to justify the huge risks involved in research. And that goes especially for outdoor field research, like the ScOPeX experiment that was planned for Kiruna, which were particularly dangerous in terms of developing technology for deployment without answering any of the serious questions about what deployment would actually do to our environment.
I've
Yeah,
got a follow
thank-
up,
I
but I'd
know-
like to let Jenny speak first because she hasn't
Yeah,
had
I
a
was.
chance.
Yeah, I can see that you want to speak, Michael. I will come to you. I just want to, before you speak, Jenny, just say for those who are not so familiar with the issue. So the ScOPeX experiment is a proposed. It's a research project, a proposed outdoor experiment for stratospheric aerosol injection. So solar geoengineering of the type that we've described here on the panel. And a proposed test flight to test equipment in Sweden was stopped. We'll hear more about that in the second panel. So if you're interested in that, stay tuned for the second panel, because that will be the focus for that panel. Jenny, just on that question of research, actually, I'm interested, you've already begun to talk about how this affects people differently across the globe. Raymond described how it's very hard to predict how this is, how this would affect whom on the planet, and these models are not very reliable. But so a lot of people researching, promoting geoengineering argue that they do it for the people in the global south, for those most impacted by climate change. They need that as a last resort because of the severe impacts of climate change. So what do you actually hear from researchers, activists, policymakers, and movements in the global south when it comes to geoengineering and geoengineering research?
Yeah, so I think one of the issues associated with that question is about when is this distinction between research and deployment as well, and when to start research. And as was just talked about, those who are advocating for research are not advocating for deployment now because they think it's not bad enough now. Yet it is really bad right now for many people, right? And so this disconnect between when it's going to be bad enough to argue for deployment is actually a twisted kind of argument, because nobody is advocating for solar geoengineering deployment right now. So that also speaks to, also with the research question, those who are advocating for research have said, oh, if we do more research and we find out that it's too dangerous to deploy, then we will stop doing the research, which is also a little bit a skeptical stance, because there's no clear avenue for what's going to decide that, oh, now we've figured out that it really is too dangerous, so we should stop doing research, right? Like there's no clarity on that. But with regard to the question more explicitly about the global south, I mean, given it's been a very small group of people who've been working on this and advocating for research, and so I think that the sense is that it's just a small group that is now trying to broaden the conversations and even provide resources so that other parts of the world can also participate and engage, and even participate in the research in solar geoengineering. I think that leaves questions about who is trying to promote and advance different ideas, and where the funding is coming from, and this kind of colonial perspective of, oh, you might need this because you're and so there's a lot of problematic things going on, I think, in the research space as well.
Can I add something about the global south? Or
Yes, briefly, and then to Michael.
yeah, just say that the pro research solar geoengineers are often talking about how the global south needs this, but how much foreign aid do we actually provide to the global south? How much have we actually devoted, sacrificed ourselves for the sake of helping the global south? And if you just think about a situation where it turns out where the kind of solar geoengineering that's good for bankers in New York is clobbering the Indian monsoon or having some bad effects on the Somali farmers. I can bet you it's not the Somali farmers that are going to actually get to choose what kind of climate they want. What the global South needs from the global North is for us to just stop emitting so darn much CO2.
Amen. So if I could just connect 2 points that have been made by Ray and Jenny here, because I think it's important. This idea that we can, if we find out that it's producing, negative responses and impacts, we'll just stop doing it. Well, the problem there, as Ray already said, it's sort of like, climate methadone. It's an addiction. And if we, decide to kick the can down the road, to the extent that the forces of inaction, polluters are able to say, look, we can continue to burn fossil fuels now because we've got this stopgap solution. We've got geoengineering. Trust us. We'll implement it. It'll work out just great. So at that point, we become dependent on that technology because we haven't then worked hard enough to solve this problem the safe way by reducing carbon emissions. We find ourselves too far down the road. And so, as Ray has used this analogy, it's sort of like, okay, well, if we find out that, the medical apparatus isn't working, we can remove the life support. The problem is when you remove the life support, you die. We become dependent on this technology. And if it proves to be disastrous, then we're in a lose-lose scenario. There's nothing we can do. We've gone too far down the road. One other point about research. I think it's important to distinguish between climate modeling experiments, many of which have actually revealed the potential negative consequences. Our colleague Alan Roebuck, for example, who's one of the leading climate modelers, who's done a lot of modeling work in this area, has an article that he wrote some years ago called 20 Reasons Not to Do Geoengineering. It's because of the model simulations that he's done and others have done that we understand some of the real potential unintended consequences of implementation. So that's the modeling work, and we should do it if for no other reason because it can actually reveal the problems, reveal the risks and the threats. That's very different from actual field work and implementation. And one of the things I find really troubling is that some of our colleagues who are very geoengineering, who are sort of geoengineering promoters have in fact already begun to construct planning documents for how this would be done. They have for-profit companies that they've started that would actually implement that technology. And so there are huge conflicts of interest here. And that's also true with people like Bill Gates, who have been funding this research and once again have for-profit ventures that stand to benefit if we go down that road. I can think of no better example of moral hazard than that.
Thank you. So I just want to invite the audience to send their questions in. We're receiving questions from a number of sources, and I'll try to prioritize questions from press because we've invited press to this event. And many questions already, but just so we're screening them, and I'm taking them up as we go along. So please put in your questions. And we do have a couple more that I think are definitely worthwhile exploring. One is if you could, that would probably be Ray or Michael, to speak a bit more about the impacts of sulfite aerosols and what that does if we were to experiment with that technology. And I'm also wondering if you could talk about if this is actually a technology that can be tested ever, if we can ever do research that would give us any certainty that this would work, because my understanding is that that's not possible. So maybe you can speak to that. And there are other questions, so you can think about that, Jenny already, and others if you'd like to. So how can we prevent those promoting these technologies like Bill Gates and others? How can we prevent them from pursuing that? So what are the strategies? People are getting interested in actions and movement building here. So who wants to start?
Oh, you mentioned Ray about the impact of the aerosols, please. Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah, I won't start talking about actions. I think the second panel would do a much better job on that than I would. But in terms of without giving a whole lecture on sulfate aerosols, but sulfate aerosols are small liquid droplets, basically sulfuric acid, that are formed from chemicals that would be shot up into the stratosphere. Now, they're very good at reflecting sunlight, even in small quantities, but they do a number of other things to the chemistry of the stratosphere. In particular, they do provide surfaces that can catalyze, that can increase the speed of ozone destroying chemical reactions. That's special to the sulfate aerosols and a few other kinds of particles. They also have the effect of heating up the upper atmosphere in a way that doesn't cancel the cooling effect of carbon dioxide. And so these indirect effects of clobbering the stratospheric climate, the upper atmospheric climate, by these heating effects are also potential game changers for stratospheric chemistry and physics. And finally, there was, I think that's those are the essential things about the sulfate aerosols. But as for the question of whether research can answer any of the questions, that essentially the biggest questions are on a global scale. The biggest unknowns are on a global scale. Things like how the global cloud patterns would respond, how the global circulation patterns would respond, what happens when you inject some new chemical, some novel chemical into a stratosphere that's already saturated with this chemical. That's not something that volcanoes even really do, because a volcano is sort of a one-off thing. It's not continuous. None of those questions can be answered by any experiment, in air quotes, short of an actual global deployment. And even then, it would take many years of data collection just to sort out what we have actually done to our planet. And the risk of outdoor experimentation is that it can answer the sort of questions relevant to engineering for deployment without answering any of the really serious, important questions about what would happen if there were a deployment. And that's why I think a global moratorium on outdoor experimentation in this area is a starting point for where we should be on this issue going forward.
Thank you. And I think it's a good idea to leave the actions question for the second panel. When I look at the questions coming in, I see there are a few related to the US. And since we've got a panel here that knows a lot about the US, and there have been recent developments, I'd like to pose this question maybe to Michael. So there's been a recent report by the National Academy of Sciences in the US on these technologies, and there is a call to invest up to $200 million over 5 years into research, so a public research program. So this report also talks about marine cloud brightening and cirrus cloud thinning, other geoengineering technologies. So what do you think of that? What do you think of that report and the messages?
Yeah, but first I wanted to provide Jenny an opportunity, because I think you had also posed a question to her. Not sure she got a chance to respond.
Yeah, well, I could respond to both of those briefly. I wanted to just acknowledge the Bill Gates question and how to get the tech billionaires to invest in other ways of climate action instead of solar geoengineering. I've thought about that quite a bit, about, if only he was interested in investing in climate justice or some other ways, but he's admitted that he doesn't know anything about climate politics. So, I think we should hold him accountable and others to, show up as experts and putting their money behind things, and then acknowledging there's so much that they don't know. And I think it's a dangerous in a democratic society to have people having that much power and influence. The other question you asked about the National Academy's report, I think the recommendations of that report are risky and dangerous, and particularly the role of the United States, because one of the things we didn't talk a lot about yet is the governance challenges of this, not just governance of deployment, which you can imagine our international governance mechanisms are not adequate to, provide a structure to manage or to consider this, but even in advancing research for one country like the United States to go ahead and advance research unilaterally without broad public discourse about these risks that we're talking about here, I think is really problematic. And several of us have been speaking up about the negative political implications of the recommendations of that report. The report does acknowledge, some of these risks, but then the actual recommendations that follow seem to not integrate these considerations of risk.
Let me
Thank you.
briefly follow up. I just put in the chat a link to a Guardian piece that Ray and I wrote some time ago after that report came out. I'm a member of the National Academy, and I had great difficulty in standing by their report. It was a bit frustrating for me. It was the first major report that they had published since I was elected to the Academy, and I was very disappointed with it. Chris Field, who led the effort, is a great scientist. I think he tried to be balanced, but it's very difficult to be balanced when just the very idea that we're promoting research that in crossing that line from sort of theoretical modeling into sort of field deployment, it's difficult to not be putting your thumbs on the scale. And so the National Academy did end up lending increased credibility. And, we even have Democrats now in Congress who are building geoengineering into their climate. Democrats. It's troubling. One of the statements in the preface to the report was particularly troubling to me because it really, I think, crystallized the basic problem here with the politics of, and Bill Gates does say he doesn't know the solution to the politics of climate change. Then move over, buddy, because it is a to solve this problem. What we need is the political will. And in the preface to the report, there's a statement that essentially, I'm going to paraphrase it, we probably aren't going to be looking into geoengineering. That is the moral hazard that we've been talking about. The very idea that we could deploy this technology in the future is being used as a crutch to take the pressure off polluters and policymakers to solve this problem. As Ray and I and others have said, the only safe way there is to solve this problem, to stop burning carbon and putting carbon pollution into the atmosphere.
And if I could just briefly follow up on the
Very
report.
briefly, yep.
Yeah, the headline number in all the press was the $200 million research program. I read through the several hundred pages of the report. Most of the report is about all the reasons for not doing this and about the extreme governance structure you would need in order to even conceive of doing something like an outdoor experiment. So I kept saying, where are they going to justify this $200 million? And then I got to the end of the report and they almost didn't do it. There were about 3 pages where after all these reasons for not doing it, they just pull a number out of the air with no justification for that number. And it's ludicrous that the report should never have passed review. But there are powerful forces that want to see a report like this justifying research, expanded research done, and those forces can sometimes have their way.
Okay, I can tell you that looking at what is happening in the US right now on the solar geoengineering front, from outside of the US, from Europe, looks extremely scary. And it's very hard to understand. We're almost at the end of our panel. I have one last question for Jenny that was asked. If you could elaborate very briefly on how the social change approach could work for cutting emissions and reducing atmospheric carbon. Just very, we've talked a lot about sort of getting out of fossil fuels. Can you just give us some more ideas on what you have in mind?
Absolutely. So I think just focusing on decarbonization and CO2 emission reductions and on its own is ineffective and inefficient, because that's not what most people wake up every day worrying about. So what we need to do is connect decarbonization and the transformation away from fossil fuels to a renewable-based society, to jobs and economic justice, to housing and transportation, to health and food systems. And so we need to take a more holistic approach. And so that's what climate justice policies are all about. And that's where we have a real opportunity. And that's where the climate crisis is actually an opportunity to take away and reverse this concentration of wealth and power by holding these polluter elite accountable and redistributing power, literally and figuratively, through a renewable transformation.
Thank you so much. I know we haven't been able to answer all of the questions, and we'll try to see if some of the panelists here can still answer some of the questions in the Q&A box in writing when we close here for this session. I have one last question for you. Or actually, you can pick. I've got two, and you've got 1 minute. Just pick one of those two questions for a final round. Either just share again, what is the one most important warning when facing the idea of solar geoengineering that you want us to keep in mind after today's event? What's the one most important thing? My other question, but don't try and do both, is not many scientists have actually been outspoken on this topic. And so what's your, and you're on this panel with us today, and we're very grateful for that. So what's your main message to fellow scientists who until now have remained silent, but who basically agree with you? What would you say to them? So maybe we'll start. Who wants to go first?
I'm happy to start out.
Okay, you first.
So, what I would really emphasize is that look who's promoting, geoengineering now. What you have are, people like Australian Prime Minister Scott Morrison, who's saying, look, we will solve this problem through future technology, geoengineering, and they're using it as an excuse for not putting forward credible pledges right now to bring carbon emissions down. And so let's understand that geoengineering, whether we like it or not, and it's beyond our control at this point, it will be used as a crutch for inaction, for current day inaction, and promoting geoengineering thus plays into the tactics of what I call the new climate war, kicking the can down the road, committing us to catastrophic warming based on the false promise of a future solution. And it's not a coincidence that you've got people like Rex Tillerson and Bill Gates. These are the people promoting it. The point I would make about fellow scientists, I would just say, read my op-ed in the New York Times from 2014. If you see something, say something. The motto is borrowed from our Department of Homeland Security, but it applies to us as scientists. Our oath as planetary doctors, if you will, should be to first do no harm. And geoengineering promotion violates that oath.
Yeah, and I would just add very quickly to get involved and resist and speak up and hold people accountable, and particularly focusing on the transformation away from fossil fuels is essential, and don't let the geoengineering get into the mainstream even more than it already has. So I think, and similarly to other scientists, I would echo what Michael said. It's our responsibility to speak up and to get involved and to share what our research shows, and then make that connection with policy.
Thank you. Ray.
Yeah, and I would just say the most pernicious misunderstanding of geoengineering, solar geoengineering that's out there is that this is something we can use to buy time. That's the word that's often used, to buy time to do something about carbon dioxide emissions. And that is just completely wrong, because of what I said earlier, that once the carbon dioxide is emitted, with known technology, you can't unemit it. So if you become dependent on solar geoengineering, you're dependent on doing it forever. It doesn't buy time. The only time to get carbon dioxide emission under control is right now and as soon as possible. It's not something that can be deferred. And so we just have to buckle down and do it because there is no plan B. We would like to think there was some plan B in case we don't succeed, but the only alternative is a completely hellish world that I don't think any of us would want to live in or any of us would want our descendants to live in.
Thank you. This is the end of our first panel of this event. I would really like to thank all three of you for being here and sharing your knowledge, for being guardians of this planet. If you've watched carefully, you've seen some sneak preview of some of the panelists coming into the backstage already for the next part of the event. So this part is over, this session is over, but I'll hand over to my colleague Silvia Ribeiro from ETC Group, who's going to lead us over to the next panel on voices for movements around the world. Thank you, be well, and see you soon.
Thanks, folks.
Thank you, bye.
Hello. Hello, everybody. And well, thank you very much to the panelists that just has been there. It was a really amazing panel. Lots of information. I really recommend to anyone that couldn't join earlier to follow that up later and see the recordings that we will upload. And I am Silvia Ribeiro from ETC Group. I'm based in Mexico. ETC has been following the issue of geoengineering since 2006, when most people thought it was just science fiction. But as we listened to the previous panel with perspectives from scientists on the risk of geoengineering, concerning developments are already happening, including, as Michael Mann just said, false promises to future solutions that are already now deviating from the real actions we need now to get out from emissions that cause climate change. So let me just remind you that this event is organized by the Center for International Environmental Law, the ETC Group, the Heinrich Böll Foundation, the Indigenous Environmental Network, the Saami Council, and What Next? In collaboration with the Swedish ScOPeX network, the Swedish Researchers Desk, and the Hands of Mother Earth campaign, also called HOME. The HOME campaign has 195 members. Many of us organizing this panel are members of the HOME campaign, and we are from 45 countries, including environmental and climate justice organizations, women's human rights, indigenous peoples, and farmers organizations. Most members of the HOME campaign are from the Global South. This campaign was founded during the World Peoples Conference on Climate Change in Bolivia in 2010, that many of you may remember. And because of the increasing attention and attempted experiments and funds given to geoengineering, it was relaunched in 2018 at the People's Solidarity to Solutions Week in San Francisco. The Hands of Mother Earth Manifesto is the basis for the campaign, and it is open for further signatures at the link that you will see in the chat. We will soon start a second really exciting and important panel with voices from movements, indigenous peoples, youth and climate activists on solar geoengineering. I will now hand over soon the floor to Niklas Hallström from Sweden, who has been instrumental in the campaign to stop the ScOPeX geoengineering experiments there, and he will moderate and lead us through the movements panel. Before that, a really quick announcement for Spanish speakers. Buenos días, bienvenidas, bienvenidos. Pueden escuchar la traducción al castellano presionando el icono con un globo terráqueo, seleccionar el canal de castellano. Gracias. So Niklas, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Sylvia, and welcome everyone to the second part of this this extraordinary event. I'm not sure if anybody has mentioned that everybody we invited to take part in these two panels accepted without exception. So I think that's probably a record, and it really shows how important this topic is for a lot of people to engage on. So I've been introduced. My name is Niklas Hellström. I'm based in Sweden. My organization is called What Next, and I'm also a board member of the etc. group. And I have followed these issues for quite a long time, probably almost 20 years since first discussions happened about something that just seemed too nuts and too crazy, and just why do we bother even thinking about these things that are so far-fetched and absolutely the wrong thing to even bother about? And some people were calling out and saying, look, we might have a slippery slope in front of us. We might get to a place where these things actually starts to be discussed in more seriousness, and we have to watch out. And that's exactly where we are. This is the time when we need to be very clear on where we're heading and what needs to be done and not. I will just start. I will ask also the panelists to turn on their videos, and we will have them on as we go through this panel. And I think we'll just be managed from the back end in terms of those who speak will be more visible. And I just wanted to take you through a little bit of an introduction here and a sort of a stage setting. As Sylvia said, we have had some very exciting times here in the last few months in Sweden, where we found ourselves having to really fight a project around solar geoengineering that just appeared on our doorstep in December, and eventually we succeeded, at least for now, to keep it off bay. And we'll get back to talking a bit more about that. What I'd like to just share here with you is, if this works and the screen works, is just to, let me see, go back here, to say that in this panel, which I think you've all taken note, the lineup is incredible. We have Naomi Klein, we have Greta Thunberg, Tom Goldtooth, Åsa Larsson Lind, Bill McKibben, Vandana Shiva, joining us, and I'll introduce them a little bit more as we take a first round. But before doing that, I wanted to flag, and also some of the people here I'm sure have joined and didn't have the privilege to an opportunity to listen to the first hour. It's recorded, you can listen to that afterwards. But just to highlight some of the key points that were mentioned in the very rich hour of concerns shared by scientists. And here's one attempt to kind of pinpoint that into six reasons, which each of themselves really disqualify the idea of solar geoengineering as an option to even consider. The first one is, of course, the actual impacts of deployment on climates, on ecosystems, on a system that is destabilized already, and this would just increase and exacerbate those disturbances. It's not dialing back safely, it's actually escalating disturbances. The second one is what's called termination shock. What happens when you've gotten into this and you can't get out of it, because once you stop, temperatures shoot up like an explosion, and you're probably worse off than facing a shifting monsoon, which is maybe happening. So you're stuck in an impossible situation, a nightmare. The third one, which was also mentioned a lot by Jenny's research in the previous panel, is the impossible governance requirements. There's risks of wars, who controls the thermostat, geopolitics, inequalities. This could be a serious cause for conflicts. And also, how do you ensure a technology will be governed over thousands of years, possibly fail-safe? That's an impossible requirement, which really disqualifies the idea. Fourthly, and we'll get back to that a lot in this panel, I think, too, the moral hazard, as it's known. How this actual conversation, even if none of the first three things happen, there's no deployment. But what if this delays and makes us miss the opportunity we have in the next few years, really, to to turn course and really do what's needed. Fifth, exacerbate inequalities and climate justice injustices. And six, the slippery slope, which also was mentioned in the last panel. We get back, I'm sure, here. Step-by-step research seems benign and not too bad, but what does it have? Where does it lead? How do we sort of enshrine and get locked into commercial interests, research careers, and so forth? So that's really an attempt at summarizing a rich first hour, and there's much more to read, of course. Now, just giving the context of what happened in Sweden, we were again alerted by this, and I think we'll hear more from our panelists to the prehistory of this ScOPeX project, the Harvard-based ScOPeX project that all of a sudden, not even knocked on the door, we just found out. There was no mentioning whatsoever that this was heading our way. We found out the back way when it was already sort of decided, agreed with a space corporation in northern Sweden to fly a first balloon test flight. And quickly, Swedish society, civil society, researchers, and not least indigenous peoples, the Saami people, had to engage, understand, learn, and mobilize, and also link up with international people in civil society, of whom many you've already seen and met and are also part of organizing this event. This resulted in strong action. Some letters that I think will be shared in the chat had a significant impact, led to media and international media, Swedish media, a lot of attention, and eventually by 31st of December, the space corporation, the Swedish Space Corporation in Kiruna, announced that they would cancel the flight. They wouldn't do this. They understood, and they said, this is now, we understand, too controversial of an issue. It's not mature. We don't have international agreements as to whether this is sensible or not. It's not for us to do this now, which resonated a lot with what had been voiced by the critique, not least from the Saami people. The project itself says that they will not give up. They will come back. They will now engage with Swedish society. They will now try to convince and turn public opinion, and they hope to fly in 2022. I think that's no chance that will happen. Swedish society is mobilizing, but more than that, there's this international mobilization, which this panel is really a proof of, that says this is not about Sweden, this is not about Sami lands, this is about something way beyond. This is a global concern. Wherever this technology gets implemented and deployed, it affects us all as much. So that is the context for what we're going to talk about now. And I will just flag here that there is a video also that we will circulate, and there's a site to be coming to the fore soon, where you will find more information about this particular fight and struggle in Sweden, along with lots of resources that also ties to the work that has already been going on for quite some years from civil society. So I will stop the screen sharing here and turn to Åsa Larsson-Blind, who is the first person in the lineup, this incredible lineup. And Åsa, you are a Saami reindeer owner. Sometimes I've talked with you and you're on the mountain and one hears the wind and you're out there doing what you, I'm sure, love the most, but you're also an amazing organizer and have a career also as first woman president of the Swedish Reindeer Association, Saami Association, and also has been the president of the Saami Council and is now vice president of the Saami Council. So very much engaged in indigenous peoples circles globally, and took action very quickly. I think this issue was new to you. You hadn't been aware or engaged by the early part of the year, or late last year, but quickly learned a lot, engaged, and we'll hear more from our colleague Tom, hopefully, who is fighting a pipeline right now, in taking action. So I'd like to give you the floor first, and the way we do this is just have a few minutes for each person in the panel to elaborate on a certain different kinds of angles to this, and then we'll have another round, and you can also cross sort of reference and reflect on each other. Åsa, I would like to just ask you, some initial reflections here on, why did you take such action so decisively And how does this sort of resonate to your worldview as Saami people, and how do you see the sort of major concerns that triggered your incredible engagement on this issue? And I also think you have something to maybe share that is quite exciting in taking the fight forward. So also I'll give the floor to you.
Thank you so much, Niklas, for that introduction. And at first I just want to extend my thank you for the previous panel that was so important and raised so many important points for also setting the stage for our discussion. Yes, as Niklas said, we have, and I have had a very steep learning curve on this topic of solar geoengineering. We were at first initiated to this issue in February this year, when we found out that the planning of testing in Giron, in the heart of Saami, were ongoing. And we reacted quite instinctively. When we learned what the idea of solar geoengineering is and what they are attempting to do, we reacted instinctively because this goes against our worldview, that we as humans should live and adapt to nature, and that it goes against the respect of which we are taught to treat nature and Mother Earth. And it's the whole idea of that the line of thought that has put us actually in the climate crisis in the first place should also be the one thing taking us out of it. And there our position is clear, that now is the time for all society to listen to what Mother Earth is telling us and what nature is telling us. We need to take a step back now. And our focus should be on finding a way to a sustainable, climate-friendly society. And this is why we have reacted and engaged ourselves in this together with other organizations and allies, with the result of the cancellation of the tests in Giron. But now when we have engaged ourselves in this issue, our position is clear, that this technology, the solar geoengineering, that is not a part of our chosen future. So this is also why we have taken the initiative to gather indigenous peoples from all around the world in a joint letter to the Harvard University, urging them to put a stop to the ScOPeX project. And the message in this letter is that we as indigenous peoples do not approve of the legitimizing the development towards the solar geoengineering technology, and nor for it to be conducted in or above our lands, our territories and skies, and nor in any ecosystems anywhere. So this is our next step, to put a stop to the ScOPeX, because we need now a global discussion on this topic. That is that's for us evident. And there is not a time, it's not the time to start testing and developing this technology. And we have now about 30 indigenous peoples organizations from all around the world that have signed this letter, and we will send this to Harvard this week. But in addition to this letter, we have also started an open call for support that is open for everyone to sign, and we have the petition on our website, and the links to this will be shared during this event. So everyone that will support and wants to support our indigenous call to Harvard on this ScOPeX project is free to sign this petition and show your support. So this is also our way to raise our voice and to show that we as Indigenous peoples, we want to take part in the discussion of our future. This is our joint future we are talking about. And Indigenous peoples needs to be part of that discussion. And I will probably get the opportunity to come back to that, to talk about the need to also listen and to learn from the richness of Indigenous knowledge. So I will stop there. And I'm looking forward to hearing from the other panelists. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Åsa, for that first reflection. And I think you've all seen the link in the chat to this, I think, extraordinary letter. It's a very powerful letter, and I think it is also a very educational letter. It speaks to a lot of dimensions that has been raised already in the first panel and by you now, and I think that's going to be very useful for not just Indigenous peoples whom you've approaching, but also the rest of us. So again, do sign up and show your support if you agree with the letter. I will now turn, I think, to Vandana Shiva, because we were originally hoping that Tom would come in here and tell about how he linked up with Åsa as a transition, but he's fighting a pipeline, which is a good excuse for coming late to a webinar. I think he will show up. He said he was going to try, but he's really out on the front line, to say the least, right now. So I will invite Vandana, who is next in line. Vandana Shiva, a dear, I would say, a very long-term dear friend. It's great to reconnect, Vandana. You played a very big part in my life in pointing to maldevelopment in your early book, Staying Alive, and even helped me get my first job and my partner. So I can't be enough grateful to you. But you are also a physicist as well as an amazing activist, and you combine these two identities in the work you've been doing. You set up a research foundation and also a seed collecting entity in India. And you also are a recipient of the Right Livelihood Award Prize, and I could go on forever in terms of your CV. But I think you're also keen to share the sort of reflections on what's going on here. So we'll move to that, and you can add if you want to mention something more in terms of where you're from. But I'd invite you to do a first round of reflection here, and of course speak to what you think is most important to highlight. But I believe your understanding of a holistic science and seeing the reductionism and this dialing back the average temperature, as Ray said in the first panel, as if that's a problem. It's not a problem of averages, it's a problem of complexity and systems that are getting more messed up the more we intervene at this level. So Vandana, maybe that as a starting point or other things, please, we're eager to hear your initial reflections.
Thank you, Niklas. Greetings to all. Dear friends, most of you, to the scientist who I heard the last bit, very, very high respects to them, and to the Saami who have spoken Earth. And by speaking Earth, they've spoken for all of us. I want to thank you all. At a time when these crazy aggravation of climate change looked unstoppable, you have put a stop, and you've put in front the power of the earth, the power of Indigenous people, the power of women. So thank you, Asa. Now, my understanding of climate change is that it's a pollution problem. We emitted greenhouse gases by burning dead carbon and fossil fuels, and they created a layer which was called the greenhouse effect. And that's why they call greenhouse gas emissions. And then you get climate change, but climate change is not a linear temperature increase, it's climate chaos. You don't know when the cyclone will come, you don't know when the drought will come, you don't know when in the hot tropics you'll get hailstorms, you don't know when in the deserts you'll get flood. It's climate chaos. It's scrambling Gaia's self-organizing systems of managing the climate. James Lovelock called her Gaia because he realized with his studies for NASA that the earth regulates her climate. And just like our bodies in health regulate our metabolism. It's when we eat junk food, we get diabetes, a metabolic disorder, and the junk food that the earth has been fed on with fossil fuels and greenhouse gas emissions is the climate problem. This so-called experiment, it's stratospheric controlled perturbation experiment. Every word is a nonsense. It's not controlled. You don't have a containment. Controlled experiments are done with boundary conditions. Perturbations are small disturbances. You are adding pollution to the existing pollutions, creating the same instability. So pollution for a pollution problem, deliberate climate change as a solution to climate change is not just insane, but it is, as Einstein said, repeating the mindset that got you into the crisis in the first place. And what is that mindset? A mechanistic worldview, the idea of mastery and control, and engineering solutions for everything living. The first reason why it's not controlled is you are using sulfates. And sulfates are going to come down on Earth as sulfuric acid and acid rain. It is not part of the parameters they're even thinking about. But the two other aspects that they're not thinking about is the sunshine is the primary source of energy for life on Earth. When the sun shines on this green leaf, with chlorophyll, we get photosynthesis. We get the amazing capacity of this leaf to absorb carbon dioxide and give us oxygen, but give us carbohydrates. Blocking the sun means blocking photosynthesis. Blocking the sun means putting food production and food security at risk, and the grazing of the reindeer at risk. And you don't know, it's totally unpredictable what it's going to do. But it's doubly wrong because this green leaf is the alternative to fossil fuels. We need to move from hydrocarbons to carbohydrates, the molecule of life, which gives us everything we need, the food we need, the fiber we need, the food of the animals, everything hangs on the sunshine and the green leaf. And this is what they want to block. Therefore, it is, of course, a crime against the earth. It's a crime against life. And more than that, the sun is not the problem. The sunshine falling on our skins is a source of vitamin D. And vitamin D is vital to a strong immunity. During this COVID crisis, it's become so clear that low vitamin D has been associated with the increase in inflammatory cytokines and a significantly increased risk of pneumonia and upper respiratory tract infections. So they actually have a plan to aggravate things like the COVID disaster. Just like the Saami, we in India hold the earth as sacred. We hold the sun as sacred. And we have a beautiful prayer. As the sunshine dispels that darkness of the world, Surya, the god, sun god, Surya also removes the darkness of ignorance and bestows wisdom. The sun is said to be the embodiment of all knowledge. I hope the sun will shine on the minds that have been shut down and darkened out with ignorance, but they have money power and they think money is a substitute for knowledge. It is not. Thank you.
Thank you, Vandana, for those introductory reflections. As we accumulate lots of input here, and I will swiftly move to Naomi Klein, who is next in line. I think you don't need much introduction, as many in this panel, or everyone in this panel, very well known and has followed this issue for a long time. I remember your early work on This Changes Everything and the movie and so on was much centered around geoengineering, and you had a chapter in that book as well. And we're very keen to hear your thoughts on what's happening right now, what sort of has transpired over this many years now, and of course with this very crucial moment of a real struggle. And just to say, for those who came in late here into this session, that this experiment in Sweden, the ScOPeX experiment, was really about sending a balloon high up in the stratosphere to do a first release of particles, not in massive amounts, but as a very crucial crossing a red line into not just talking and modeling, but starting to implement and develop kind of technology, and of course socializing and normalizing something that many see as a really no-go area. And of course, there's politics in that kind of step-by-step slippery slope process, which you've seen in so many other areas too. So with your amazing, brilliant analyses, Naomi, as author and researcher, please share your thoughts on where we are right now. The floor is yours.
Sure, thank you. So good to see you. So good to see all of you. Terrifying to follow Vandana. I won't speak for very long. I want to thank Asa for your amazing leadership and for stepping up so powerfully in this struggle that you didn't ask for, but landed above you. And I don't think it's. I think you know that it isn't a. It isn't by happenstance that Indigenous people are on the front lines of this. When I was researching the chapter in This Changes Everything about geoengineering and specifically solar radiation management, but the whole discussions out of what is sometimes called the geo clique, because it really is a very small number of people who have been pushing this for a long time. You would hear a lot of talk about experimenting in the Arctic and places where there aren't very many people or are virtually empty. You'd hear this sort of terra nullius type of language, right? And I think it definitely fits in to that history of imagining empty lands where experiments can take place. And here, where I'm speaking to you from unceded Coast Salish territory in so-called British Columbia, the unceded territory of the Sechut Nation. And a few years ago, I think about at this point, 7 years ago, we learned of this rogue geoengineering experiment that happened north of here in Haida Gwaii, unceded Haida Gwaii territory. And it was this rogue engineering entrepreneur that was selling kind of this promise, a false promise of carbon credits for the Haida's protection of their forests, if they allowed him to dump a whole bunch of iron filings in the ocean, which he claimed had proven that if you do this, you'll have this algae bloom. But once again, it was Indigenous people. He did not have the consent of the true leadership of the Haida, and this kind of predatory terra nullius logics that this fits into. So I hesitate to say his name, but because he likes to fight. But David Keith is a fellow Canadian, and the legitimacy of this project that he is leading at Harvard, a lot of it comes from the name Harvard. And Bill couldn't talk about that as a Harvard alum. I can talk about the fact that David Keith used to be at University of Calgary in the heart of the tar sands territory. The pipeline that Tom Goldtooth is fighting is a tar sands pipeline. We're fighting a tar sands pipeline here that's going through unceded Secwepemc territory, and unceded Coast Salish territories. Fighting it very hard, but I think this is significant. This is significant because David Keith is in business with tar sands companies. His private company, which is an air capture company called Carbon Engineering, the two major funders for Carbon Engineering, and this is different from his solar radiation management research. He also has this side business, and this was mentioned I believe by Michael Mann in the earlier panel, that there are all these conflicts of interest where the scientists who are pushing this most aggressively have their own private companies, which benefit from the normalization of the idea of a techno-fix, right? So David Keith has this company, Carbon Engineering, which proposes not to pull carbon out of the atmosphere through the brilliance of plants and trees, as Vandana has been talking about for so long, but to build horrific metal contraptions to suck it out of the air, requiring massive mining. So you have the not only do we have this proposal of solving a crisis of pollution with more pollution, but also the idea that you solve a crisis of extractivist logics and of extractive practices through more extraction of metals to build these metal trees. So that's the business that David Keith is in. And his two main funders to get this off the ground were Bill Gates and a guy named Murray Edwards. Murray Edwards is probably the richest man in the Alberta tar sands. He has a company that is one of the major players in extracting bitumen from the Alberta tar sands. So what's his interest in geoengineering? It's obvious. It is that moral hazard that so long as you're holding up the promise of a techno fix, then you can keep digging it up. You can keep digging it up and you keep laying these pipelines. So it is all, I think, really connected. And I think it is really relevant that David Keith, though he certainly identifies as an environmentalist and is certainly worried about the climate crisis, is so actively in business with one of the major drivers of said climate crisis. So not just any old billionaire like Bill Gates, but somebody so embedded in the tar sands. And I think just one of the things that I would throw out is you hear a lot, and we talked about this in the earlier panel, that a lot of this is being done in the name of the global South, in the name of the people who are on the front lines. But I think if we really want to see how this would actually play out, look at vaccine apartheid. Why would we imagine that the same global order that is allowing the global South to die in massive numbers unnecessarily because of protections of intellectual property through publicly funded research, why would we imagine that anything would be different in the way these technologies would be deployed, that somehow it would be out of some benevolent concern for lives in the global South? And I'll end there.
Thank you. Thank you, Naomi. That's great. A lot of additional input here, and it's of course embedding this in real politics and real people and real kinds of situations that is really unfolding here. And I really advise people to also look to the paper that Jenny Stevens wrote with Chemistry Prize in the last panel, which really speaks to this, also an academic piece that really looks to what partly what just talked about here, Naomi, and we'll get back. I'll move now to Tom. I think Tom has joined straight from the front lines. So please, Tom, you're a long-term activist, of course, and founder and director of the Indigenous Environmental Network, and you alerted the Saami people to what was about to happen in Sweden. So please give some few minutes. We'll try to keep this round fairly short here so we can get another round and also questions. But so much to talk about, of course. Tom, please, some initial reflections.
Yes, hello. Sorry I'm late. I had to drive close to 1 hour to get a good signal. And I hope you can hear me. I'm parked in a one-horse town in northern Minnesota. And yes, I'm on the front lines right now. Things have shifted. And so there's going to be a long-term occupation of this technology equipment coming in to drill underneath the Mississippi River. And so there's a landing there where the elders and supporters from all over the country are gathering to hold the line there. June 30th is when that equipment is destined to arrive to drill under the ground and drive and push this pipeline under that river. Yes, hello everyone. Tom Goldtooth is my name. Matoa Wayakapi is my Indian name on Dakota. From here in Minnesota, in fact, and Navajo, both Navajo from southern New Mexico, and our relatives up north are the northern Dene. I often say I'm southern Dene. But yeah, I appreciate to be briefly do a presentation on this important discussion. I can't see other people. I'm sure my sister from the Saami Nation is there. And I guess I'm an alumni of the Indigenous Traditional Knowledge Institute. We've been working on geoengineering for many years. I'm a board member of ETC Group. We became concerned about this over a decade and a half ago on these technologies that our elders, our spiritual advisors that we've been in consultation with, not only in the US and Canada, but also Alaska and the global South. Talking to them about what do you think about solar radiation management. I think that's the focus of this discussion. There's also that whole world of carbon dioxide removal, carbon capture and storage, etc. But I'm going to talk mainly about, that knowledge that we have and concerns about solar radiation management. ScOPeX was presented as a proposed initiative in the United States in the Southwest a number of years ago in the Tucson, Arizona region. And when we found out, we immediately contacted the tribe of the Yaqui, as well as the Tohono O'odham people, which live south of Tucson, and they consulted with their spiritual leaders. I talked with them as well, and they were just like appalled. And when they started to hear about this manipulation of the sky, the manipulation of the stratosphere, the different layers of the atmosphere, all the way into outer space, some of those knowledge holders know about that. They study it with past knowledge passed on to them. And they said this was a manipulation of the sacredness of the knowledge that they hold, and afraid that there could be many repercussions affecting their cultural practices, their farming, things that could not be answered by the scientists because they're still experimenting with these technologies. So that same situation came up on another project that I'm not going to talk much about, ICE 911, which is the Arctic project as well. We're just beginning to strengthen our outreach to those Inupiat, those peoples from that region who have a close relationship to the delicate ecosystem of the Arctic, with the seas, the ice, and and those people we've reached out to are similarly concerned. So it's this traditional knowledge of our indigenous peoples that we're trying to lift up to a world that doesn't value that knowledge. And some of these concerns we have, the Western form of science have no way of quantifying those spiritual and cultural values that we have to do those necessary assessments. And that same concern came to us in the project in Sweden, with that very important and special culture with the reindeer. And there's so many potential negative repercussions and risk that we feel would have a disproportionate burden on our indigenous peoples, but also other populations that have a close relationship to the land and the water. We have people down in southeast Minnesota that live next to Lake Elmo. And they were very concerned when we reached out to them. They are with the organization, the North American Water Office. Their home office is in Lake Elmo. They did not hear anything about this project doing experimentation on the lake down there. And they also are very concerned. So lack of consultation is a big concern with our indigenous peoples. We found that out with the Saami. We found that out in Tucson with the Tohono O'odham people. We found that out in Alaska with the Nupiat peoples. These projects have just, they're like keeping it a secret. And I don't know what they have to hide, but under international standards, under the tool of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, our indigenous peoples in every region where we reside, including Sweden, have a right to be the provisions of ScOPeX, free, prior, and informed consent, and the right to give their consent to these kind of projects. So I just wanted to lift that up very quickly on the important values of indigenous knowledge that understands through thousands and thousands of years of our accumulation of our knowledge to the sacredness of Mother Earth and Father Sky. That's the delicate balance. And that society, humanity, and the Western scientists must not play God. They have to be held accountable to any technology that they're proposing. Enough damages have been done with the climate and the balance of our ecosystems, yes. But we do have solutions, definitely. So that's what I wanted to share with you, everyone here. And I'll stay on as long as I can here. Thank you.
Great, Tom. Thanks for that. And I think what you raise here, of course, in terms of participation is very clear. It's been very, very striking how there's been very little participation or none. But I think also very importantly, as expressed in the Saami letters, is that this is something that is beyond participation. It's something that is just too dangerous to be done unless there is actual full global consensus that goes beyond even good consultations with people on the site. And I'd like to then hand over to Bill McKibben, writer, author, founder of 350. I think everybody knows you, Bill. You've also followed this issue a lot, and you're also been up with Tom fighting a pipeline. So there's different aspects to the same struggle, obviously, and the same forces and mindsets in play. So please, Tom, if you could share with us a few minutes, and we'll move from there. Thank you.
Nicholas, thank you very much. And what a pleasure to get to be part of all this and see so many friends and comrades. Look, I was writing about some of these schemes back in the 1980s because they've been around a very long time. These ideas that there was some get out of jail free option for dealing with climate change. And they make no more sense now than they did then, because the basic problem remains, as Vandana said, that we're filling the atmosphere with pollution. And so the correct response is not to figure out some other form of pollution to fill it with in some hope of ameliorating the first one. Is to shut off the first source. And I think that it's especially painful right now that people are trying to bring up this particular distraction, because we're finally, after 30 years, have built the political movements that have reached the point where we're beginning actually to take seriously the prospect of decarbonizing the planet. Now, I don't know whether it can be done because the extraordinary power of the fossil fuel industry is going to be pushing all the time to make sure it doesn't. But it's been very clear, the scientists have given us a very clear deadline. We have to do most of this work in the next 10 years. We have to cut emissions in half by 2030. That's what the IPCC tells us. So the question when it comes to geoengineering is, does the prospect of this playing out help or not help in that task, that most important task of cutting those emissions dramatically? And my sense of human nature is it gets in the way, it doesn't help. If someone says to you there's a deadline and then someone else says, yeah, but maybe not, that deadline's not real. Maybe at the last minute we'll come up with something that keeps you from having to actually do it. My sense of human nature is that makes it less likely that we will make the difficult choices that we have to make, that we will figure out how to override the power of the fossil fuel industry and of the billionaires backing it in the very short time that we have. Let me talk about those billionaires for just a minute. Look, our mega billionaire class is divided into two categories: those who wish to go into outer space and those who wish to stay at home and transform our planet. Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos are on the first category. And in fact, Mr. Bezos has just announced he plans to go into space himself, which seems like reasonably good news to me. But Bill Gates, who did the original funding for much of this research, is of the stay at home and come up with some technological miracles to avoid having to do the real work ahead of us, which is get off coal and gas and oil and replace it with sun and wind and conservation and efficiency. And so our job is to keep insisting that we have to move fast, that Jeff Bezos aside, there is no planet B. We're not going someplace else. And here I think is a place where it's possible to go beyond the scientific and just talk very much from the heart for a minute, to insist that this is an incredibly beautiful planet, the only one we know about that supports life. And our job is to figure out how to get it back to the state that we know works, how to get it back to the place where it can support life, human and otherwise, as powerfully as possible. This takes us in the other direction. And people haven't talked about this, but it's worth remembering that if we had named this planet honestly, we probably would have called it ocean, not Earth. And geoengineering does absolutely nothing to stop the solar geoengineering, to stop the evil twin of climate change, which is the rapid acidification of the Earth's oceans. Even if fossil fuel emissions weren't warming the planet the way they are, we would still have to stop them immediately because they're destroying the ocean chemistry on which so much of the world's biology depends. How do we do this work? It's not with this kind of radical scientific experimentation. It's with doing the work that, say, Tom is hard at work on. I had the great pleasure of getting to be with him a couple of days ago. The real action is not up in the stratosphere. The real action is out on that boardwalk that 200 people are occupying right now on the banks of the Mississippi River, keeping them from drilling a new tar sands pipeline. The real action is in Australia, where Aboriginal groups are doing an amazing job of blocking new coal mines. The real action is all over the world where people are standing up to the fossil fuel industry and where people are doing the work, finally, of starting to build out the sun and the wind that we can depend on. Even in Washington, where the president is making a good faith effort to build out an infrastructure that could help us make this transition to something else. Let me just finish by saying that I think Naomi was absolutely right when she said a lot of this depends on the name of Harvard, that's the thing they've been waving around in an effort to intimidate people into going along. And Harvard's a perfect example of why this is premature at best. Is Harvard, the richest university in the world, doing all that it can to make sure that we would never have to adopt some crazy plan like this? Harvard is not. Harvard has refused even to divest its holdings in coal and oil and gas. Harvard is still trying to profit off the end of the world. So why on earth one would take them seriously as a participant in the plan to do something for everybody's good is, I think at this point, just crazy. I'm really, really, really moved to see everybody here thinking about this question that forces us to think not just about the details of this, but forces us to think in the biggest sense about justice, about the future, about what it means to live on a planet, because that's how we have to start conceiving of this place. We have to keep remembering that we share this one planet, and it's turns out to be a very finely balanced mechanism, and our job is to get it back in balance just as fast as we possibly can. So many thanks to everybody who's pushing hard on this, and special thanks to the Saami who didn't, I mean, this fight came to them. You know, someone suddenly appears on your doorstep and says, hey, I'm going to go up and sprinkle some stuff in the sky, okay? Good for you all to figure out that this was an important place to take a stand. And it's one of those stands that's going to make a huge difference in the history of the planet going forward.
Thank you so much, Bill. Indeed, very moving. And we'll now turn to the last person in the panel. And I'll just tell you that what we'll do after Greta has given some reflections is to kind of do another round, but with questions also that we've been compiling, so we get a bit of sort of interaction in that sense. Greta, there's a lot of talk here about future generations, and the previous panel with the scientists also pointed out that this technology disqualifies itself just for the sheer fact that you imagine a technology that needs to be in place for not just one generation, but thousands of years ahead, fail safe, and distracts us from what we need to do. And nobody has been clearer than you in terms of seeing clearly and speaking clearly what needs to be done. What are your thoughts and reflections from what you've heard so far?
First of all, I just want to also thank everyone who is here, and thank all the panelists here for everything that they're doing and everything that they have achieved, especially also the indigenous peoples all around the world who are fighting on the front lines and who we couldn't be without, to be honest. But I mean, and thank you for the interesting discussions as well. I mean, there's one metaphor that perfectly describes everything about geoengineering, and that is, when you're in a hole, stop digging. We cannot move out of this crisis with the same mindset that got us into this, exactly as Vandana Shiva said. We got into this mess by thinking we could control nature, and by thinking we could manipulate, and that we are above nature. We cannot move out of it by thinking the same thing, that we are above nature and that we can control nature. That will simply not work. I mean, we just simply don't know how exactly the earth will respond to these kinds of mechanisms if we set these things going. And it's exactly how it perfectly describes how we look at nature and how we value nature. Nature is doing everything it can. It's screaming at us to back off, to stop, and we are doing the exact opposite. We're thinking that we can solve this with doing more, when we in fact need to do less. And again, as you say, this falls on future generations. It falls on us. We just assume that, well, future generations will take care of it. They will find something, they will invent something that will keep this going, that will make this safe. And if it's not safe, then that's up to them to solve. Which is just exactly also how we see the climate crisis, that this is for someone else to solve. Not to mention the injustice, the inequity aspect of it, that who gets to control this mechanism. It is probably, as the world looks like today, it is probably going to be the high-income countries and the richest people, and we will do things that benefit us, and perhaps even at the expense of other people. Unfortunately, most often that is the people living in the global south, the indigenous peoples around the world. They are almost always the ones who are going to suffer from these kinds of decisions. And that's just the exact opposite of climate justice and environmental justice and social justice. It's like we are trying to do everything we possibly can to not have to reduce emissions. We are trying to do, I mean, I have to give us credit. We have a quite big imagination, humanity. We are trying to do everything, even manipulate nature, even manipulate the sky itself, just so that we don't have to reduce our actual emissions. It's very fascinating.
Thank you, Greta. Indeed, it's very fascinating. It's an absurd situation we're finding ourselves in to even have this conversation. Well, now move into a bit more of a kind of less structured conversation, and I will ask also for panelists to chip in. We've gotten some questions, and we'll check them out, and you can respond. And the first one is really to you, Åsa, who started and set this off. And that's a question about moving forward, because this is really about action now to really take command. And I think one of the things that comes out so clearly in this panel is to say, look, to say no categorically, this is wrong, we don't need to go here, just like Greta said, that's not an extreme position, that's common sense, that's precaution. And the sort of middle of the ground, neutral, let's do some research, let's try it just in case, that's extreme. That's extreme, because that gets us over the brink, down the slippery slope into the abyss. I think that comes across very clearly from all of you. And in that line, you've written this letter also, and some questions around that is, how is it coming along? From where have you gotten responses, and how do you see the next step in this fight using this letter? Please, Åsa.
Thank you. And first, I just want to thank everyone in the panel. It's such a privilege to listen to you and to hear all these points raised on why this solar geoengineering is not the way forward. And as you say, Niklas, we have taken the step to write to Harvard. And I have to say that this is not the fight that we would like to have. This is not the issue that we would like to discuss. We want to focus on how to save the ecosystems that we are so interdependent on. We want to make sure that we can to give the future generations healthy ecosystems so they can sustain themselves. So this letter to Harvard and this discussion on solar geoengineering, it is, as has been said, kind of a detour on what we all would like to discuss and what we need to discuss. And as is also has been pointed out, we have the need for a global discussion. Of course, maybe at first to finally say stop to this development of solar geoengineering. And that is what our letter is. We hope that it can contribute to, that we as Indigenous peoples, we have now signatories from all over the world. We have about 30 Indigenous peoples organizations, and it's spread. We have from the Arctic and from Africa and from Russia and from all over. And we hope that that can show that we have a joint position and that we actually can influence the discussion to actually focus then on what we should discuss. And I would like to also touch upon what Tom said, because I believe that that is very important, that I'm convinced that Indigenous people's knowledge have the potential to play a significant role in actually finding the way towards a a sustainable future for all. And that is also why it is so important that Tom also raised that for that to happen, Indigenous peoples need to be included in the decision and in the discussions. So this is also the step that we are taking now, is also to show that we as Indigenous peoples, we want to contribute to the solutions. And we do not see that solar geoengineering is part of that. So we hope that our letter can help us getting into the discussion and the focus that we should have going forward. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Åsa. So it will be very exciting to see how this unfolds. And also, as you've said, people can join in who are also non-Indigenous, and the website link is in the chat. I have a question here also in terms of relating to this, in how can what are the best ways to take in this knowledge to grassroots movements for climate justice? How this is now a good opportunity in this webinar, of course, to get to people widely, but it needs to go much further, of course. And it's about popular education. It's about building capacity and understanding. So would anybody in the panel like to say something about that? Maybe Bill, would you be interested in thinking about the way to bring these issues to wider movements that you're connected with?
Well, I think that the way to bring them to wider movements is to just for all of us to keep reminding everybody that this is a distraction from the work that those wider movements are engaged in. That the movements are really doing the important necessary work of the moment, standing up to pipelines, pushing new energy transformation, pushing for efficiency and conservation, working on reforming agriculture, all those things that are crucial. And I think one of the things we need to do is be reminding everybody that there are people out there in whose interest it is to just ignore all that and come up with a kind of pretend solution that gets around all this. There's a way in which the geoengineering thing is sort of people saying, well, you know what, we're going to sprinkle some magic dust into the atmosphere, and then we won't have to worry anymore about all this difficult change. For the reasons that everybody spent the last 2 hours outlining, that's incorrect, and dangerous. But it's also just worth remembering that there are going to be a certain number of people for whom it's appealing, because change is hard and inertia is a really powerful force. And so it really is important to just be regularly explaining that there is no magic way around this. And one of the ways to do that, of course, is to keep using the powerful sets of metaphors that people are developing that help make clear what a kind of strange and sad set of solutions this is. I'm old enough to remember that there was a day that in day and age in which if you got good and drunk, the next morning you took bicarbonate of soda, Alka-Seltzer, to deal with your hangover. And that's a pretty good metaphor for what people are trying to do here, except that they're trying to cure not a hangover but alcoholism with an Alka-Seltzer. And our job is to do the hard work, having hit bottom as a society, of getting ourselves off the drug that got us into this problem, instead of just finding some new one to cover it up along the way. And yeah, that's hard work, and it would be easier to avoid it, but we can't avoid it. And so just saying that often enough will be helpful, I think. The problem with this is that not enough people know about it or have thought about it in enough complexity to figure out why it's not a good idea.
Just briefly there, Greta, if you're there, you disappeared from the camera. Are you maybe not there now? Then I'll come back to you. You can think about that. It would be good to hear your thoughts as to how this issue is sort of understood and or not among the young people, and how to kind of really bring that force to the fore. But in the meantime, we had a question also from one of the fighters really against ScOPeX as it unfolded in North America, in Arizona, and that was this, you know, attempt by the very same Harvard and David Keith led project there to do this flight, and they now tried it several times and failed so far every place. And the original pushback there led to against the permitting processes, and they really framed this as violations of the territorial integrity of Mother Earth. And there's some things to think about here, maybe in terms of, you know, justice principles of international law being brought to bear on this geoengineering battle. You know, I think one term that was voiced by our friend here was terracide, and some reflections on this in terms of this is really about governance, right? This is such an imposing extreme technology that nobody can escape, and it has a potential to be directed by very few people or institutions in very, you know, specific places. How do we deal with this fact, and where is the place for law and your thoughts about how to really tackle this governance issue? Is there any thoughts from the panel in relation to this question? Vandana? Yes, please.
Yeah. I think the way that Saami responded is the way most Earth citizens would respond, that this is terracide. And given that with the collapse of the Copenhagen summit, Evo Morales went back and then called the summit of people on rights of Mother Earth and climate change, and we have a draft declaration on the rights of Mother Earth, and it was presented to the UN Assembly, General Assembly, which then created a whole program on harmony with Mother Earth, exactly the points that Asa was making. I think one, we definitely need to use every option on treating this as a crime against humanity and a crime against nature and the Earth. We know that before a court or the International Criminal Court takes it up, you have to do it at citizen level. And I would say to the Saami, because you've played such a leading role, if you were to do something like what we did with the Monsanto Tribunal, where we brought all the evidence from the people and put them together, and then they emerged as a force, a global force against Monsanto, that if you were to hold a people's tribunal on geoengineering, hosting it, all of us would support you. Turn it into an assembly, turn it into a trial. And I think it's very important to know that the natural law that indigenous people follow, that common law, is higher than any colonial law on pieces of paper, because that is what's cracking up right now. And then everything is being done to do a few pieces of paper away. I mean, Bill Gates is bribing his way through. We know he did it for gene drives. He knows he's doing it for gene editing and trying to dismantle the European biosafety law. He will totally kill the climate treaty. He's destroying the food summit. He's hijacked the food summit and taken it to New York. So the second point I'd like to make is when I heard Nomi speak about this fellow Keith, my mind went to this guy called Dastak or something of the Eco Health Alliance, who was the contractor for DARPA and the government to finance the gain of function research on the coronavirus that has caused this disaster. So that is all over now. It's in Washington Post, it's in New York Times, it's everywhere. It's now in the public mainstream. And I think we should start treating the solar geoengineering as equivalent to the gain in function research in the Wuhan lab, because people are relating to that. That's where they are. and link the two. But the second is both are dual purpose technologies. It is totally established that the gain in function on the coronavirus was both potential for biological warfare and a potential for finding out more on how to treat people. But the dual purpose technology of weather modification, we are going through not just climate change havoc, but at the time of harvest, in lines the rain comes. It is crazy because a lot of it is actually engineered. And I think we need to really put together all the weather modification. After all, even in the Vietnam War, the US Army had the Project Popeye to totally distort the monsoon climate. So this is about the military use. And I think we need to start using in creative ways the NMOD Treaty, the Environmental Modification Convention, which was originally the Convention on Prohibition of Military and Other Purpose, but now it is really the convention which bans weather warfare, environmental modification techniques, which include techniques for changing through deliberate manipulation of natural processes, which solar engineering is totally a candidate for this. Natural, the dynamics, composition, structure of the earth, including its biota, lithosphere, hydrosphere, atmosphere, and the entire space. We have this international law, and we need to do more, except that, of course, Bill Gates will go with his bride to try and kill it. And handling, I think handling the big money that has become unaccountable, to me, is the biggest democratic challenge. On every sphere, whether it's health, or it's food, or genetic engineering, it's all one. And I think it is so important now to not just think of it as a climate problem. It's a problem affecting the earth. It's a problem affecting every sphere of life. And we have to find new ways to create accountability.
Thank you, Vandana. I think one quite important reflection made in the first panel too is that there's so much that comes across here, and the same kinds of problems cuts across, of course, with other technologies and other issues. But it was also singled out how solar engineering is very, very it's so extreme, and the research is really not going to answer. I mean, this whole question about research that comes up, and let's just do research can never be really bad, right? The kind of idea that we can just have research and it's neutral, it's sort of in a vacuum and it's benign. But the point that research can really not give us answers that we really need to be clear that this can be safe enough to deploy. Research then becomes a way to normalize and gain ground for something that then becomes very sort of enshrined and hard to stop once it rolls. And that's why this slippery slope, I think, is such an important issue that people are really bringing to the fore in this panel. And I think Naomi, on that, what are your thoughts here in terms of the implications on governance regimes here, and the sort of the militarization component as well in this. This is a technology that's so centralized that it has to be controlled. It could speak to authoritarianism. If you're going to keep spewing this for many, many generations, how do you ensure that that's going to happen to not risk termination shock? What kinds of terrible scenarios could that open up for that we lock ourselves into? And how do you sort of reason around that also in terms of mobilizing understanding to why this needs to be forged?
So even I've gone to a few conferences where the biggest advocates for this research are speaking and presenting the case, and they fully admit that this research can easily be weaponized, right? And they talk about the sort of worst case scenario. You get into a kind of a geoengineering war where, say, the US deploys to save its crops, that interrupts India's monsoon. India deploys to counteract the US. Then they say, oh, what about the oceans? Let's dump a bunch of filings in the ocean. So you end up very quickly with a kind of a Frankenstein Earth. And even if it was, in this kind of scenario, deployed as a, quote unquote, emergency climate response, right? It can very rapidly, and this is by, the admission of people like David Keith, get turned into a war-like scenario, a weather war-like scenario. And as Vandana mentioned, the original research for these technologies was in the context of war and deployment, even if unsuccessfully done. They tried to do cloud seeding during the Vietnam War. So I think they should be banned as weapons. And I also think that as we look at it from a movement perspective, we need to be building the broadest possible alliances here. We are not the only people with problems with Bill Gates, right? Bill Gates, as Vandana said, is running roughshod in so many different sectors. We know about global health and food, but also education. And so, this is an economic justice issue. This is a democracy issue. And I keep thinking about the fact that, as much as I understand Bill's joke that it would be nice, maybe it's not a bad thought for Jeff Bezos to blast himself off into space. I think that the outsourcing of space and the privatization of space to the billionaire class is really setting us up for privatized deployment of these technologies. And this is one of the risk scenarios that gets talked about. And so I don't think we're going to have a movement solution to this that isn't connected to the broader economic justice movements, social justice movements that are taking on the billionaire class, and really getting at the root of the excess capital that they have, right? And I think it's very, very important. There was a question in the chat about, is it fair to go after, where people are getting their funding? Isn't that like going after Al Gore's funding? I don't think it is, because when it comes to geoengineering, we really would not be having this conversation without this private philanthropic money. If you look at, if you follow the money on this, all of the research money was coming from a very small group of billionaires like Branson, like Gates, who then took it to scientific organizations like the Royal Society, right? And so, and brought it to institutions like Harvard. It came from the philanthropicapitalists and now is getting the kind of blessing of these more respected scientific institutions. So we have to talk about this entire system of privatizing knowledge. And I think we need to get the billionaires out of space, take our atmosphere back from them as a starting point.
Thank you, Naomi. And I think that there is a prospect here that has been called out by several people involved in this process here on this call too, in terms of how you mix really bad things to become not just double, but the square bad. So for example, solar radiation management, measuring solar radiation and commodifying that in terms of trading and new regimes for basically offsetting where you do solar radiation management. The seeds for setting that regime up to not measure carbon dioxide anymore, but to measure how much solar radiation you actually deflect is sort of a real warning, I think, for everyone who's been fighting also the carbon markets. And as you say, this kind of mindset of privatization being the way to deal with this problem, which of course is a mindset that you can take if you don't think there's a systems really change that is needed. That's the only way to kind of square that equation. I think that we are running close to the end of this very rich conversation. It's still just touching on of course, so many dimensions. And I'd like to do a quick run. As to say also that it seems like Greta had connections problems here and has dropped out. So we'll see if she manages to join us back before the end. But it's been great to have her on the webinar, obviously. So what we'd like to hear is just some thoughts here as to how we can best support the Saami now in this very clear, pivotal time. This letter is there. There's been a fight and a success in Sweden. This issue is now on the front line. There's a lot of media. We're all part of this moment when we also, as Bill said, this is a moment to really get to zero emissions and real zero emissions and be talking about real solutions. So how do we combine this? Some quick, we only have, you know, a minute person to distill some of the thoughts you would like to share with everyone in terms of supporting the Saami struggle and the wider struggle around this. So maybe I'll start with you, Vandana, but very, very short, just a few bullet points.
Yeah, what I offer to ASA and the Saami is through the Earth Democracy Network in India with different languages, with different indigenous communities, we will send it out to them and we'll translate it so they can endorse your letter, but also in a way for solar geoengineering, because they've said, okay, 2022, they'll find another place. We have to have a slogan which says, we are all Saami. We are all Earth citizens. And there's no place on Earth where this will be right. It is wrong everywhere.
Thank you. Bill.
Yeah, I actually think that Vandana is right about this. That the key is to make sure that that they're not, you know, sort of jurisdiction shopping to figure out where they can get away with carrying out this kind of test, because eventually they'll find someplace that's, you know, friendly enough that they can do it. The job is to make sure that everybody everywhere recognizes that this is on the horizon and that it shouldn't be taken lightly in any way. And that's, I mean, there are times when the job number one is education. And since most people don't know about this yet, that's job number one right now, is taking this letter and all the other efforts and helping people understand that there's a new fact in the world that they need to know about and why they should care.
Great, thank you. Naomi?
Yeah,
Some last words.
Well, I think that there's real potential in a shaming of Harvard strategy. Always fun, and they're great activists at Harvard who have been trying to get that institution to divest from fossil fuels for a long time. And I think that the argument that Bill was making earlier, really bringing these stories together, that it is not just that that Harvard is pushing this very, very dangerous false solution. It is that it has turned its back on real solutions really quite actively. And I think that could have a real impact. And once it's safe to travel, I think, or over Zoom, it would be great for you to be, I think, sending Saami speakers to Harvard students.
Thank you, Naomi. Also, having now listened to a lot of good thoughts and some advice and some good ideas and sharing your experience, what are your concluding thoughts at this point?
Well, first, I would like to thank everyone for the support. And I have to say that we have taken this initiative, but it is on behalf of Indigenous voices everywhere. And we see the response that we get to this letter, that we have major Indigenous organizations, representatives from all over the world. This is a joint position. So even if it's our initiative, I see it as a joint cause, and supporting the letter is supporting Indigenous voices everywhere, because we have a broad support for the letter, and we will send it, and then we will also publish the signatories to this list, so everyone can see that this is not a Saami position, it is not an Arctic position, it's a joint Indigenous position from all over the world. And we can also show with the petition and the broad support that I am sure that we will get. So please go in and sign the petition. That will also show that the Indigenous peoples are not alone in this position, that this is a global position. We are, this is a joint position, and I hope that would also make a difference. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Åsa, for those words, and very encouraging to see all the movements. And just to conclude on behalf of all the organizers to this event, thank you so much to both panels. and panelists for having taken your time to engage and show your support. This is incredibly important. This is a time in history really where things can pivot a good way or a bad way, and we might get locked in if that happens the wrong way. I think a take home here really is that there is no plan B. That is the main argument for doing this kind of work that is being thought now, but there simply is no plan B. There is only one plan, and that is full decarbonization, real solutions, phase out the fossil fuel industry justly and quickly, and get to the true knowledge and wisdom that we all share, and not least people in this panel. We know what to do, and there's no distractions to stop that. I think that's the essence of what's in this letter. Do read it. It's a fantastic letter, and let's mobilize and really turn the whole discourse and the narrative the right way. This is a moment. Things are changing. The oil industry is losing, and I think we're winning, and we're going to win this fight too, around solar geoengineering and full solutions. So I thank you everyone for listening around the world, and again thanks to all the panelists and organizers. And by that we'll close this. This recording and information will be found at the Geoengineering Monitor.org website, and there's also a stopsolargeo.org website that is coming up that also documents the struggle in Sweden. So that's a good resource, both these websites, for you who want to learn more, engage, and join up. Thanks so much, everyone.
Bye-bye.